Tēnā koutou katoa. We acknowledge that there is a strength beyond ourselves when we work together to serve others. May we put aside our own personal interests, work with integrity and openness, striving to create a community that supports its people and the environment. Let us, in a moment of quiet, focus on why we are here. We give thanks for the wisdom of the past, look for opportunities in the present, and accept the challenges of the future. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa. Kia pai te hare. Thank you. Welcome everybody to our second official Business Council meeting of the Triennium, and it's great to have a full house this time with people back from holidays and other activities. We've got a full agenda ahead of us, and I would just like to advise, of course, that we are being live streamed, and there may be a recording by the media as well, so just informing you of that. Now we have no apologies, so do we have any conflicts of interest to declare?
On the NCBI.
Thank you. No others?
So, just to give you what was you on the
What was this?
your conflict?
My husband is the chair of NCBI.
So,
Do I have a mover and seconder for conflicts? Thank you, Councillor Tapani, Councillor Price. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. And we do have some presenters in the public forum today, and I'd like to welcome Graham Robinson to present his submission to us regarding the Civic and Administration Building. Welcome, Graham, and thank you for coming and joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, as you've been told, you do have 5 minutes, and including questions from councillors. However, I'm pretty flexible with that, but if you could try to keep within that time, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Graham Robinson. I'm a chartered professional engineer, and I established my sole charge consulting engineering practice in Napier in 1976. I studied for my civil engineering degree at Canterbury University in the era when Park and Paulet led the world in research into reinforced concrete design, and when their lecture notes were compiled into a textbook that is still a reference document today. Prior to returning to Napier, I worked in New Plymouth, where I was involved with the development of the onshore Maui production station. I personally planned and supervised the geotechnical investigation on the site, and then assisted renowned earthquake engineer Latham Andrews with the preparation of a site-specific seismic or earthquake design standard that was a world-leading specification. I then designed foundations, plant and structures in accordance with the design standard, and I contributed to a manual for the design of petrochemical plants in earthquake zones that was adopted by Shell International. For more than 30 years, I carried out engagements for the Earthquake Commission. Between October 2010 and November 2014, I was based in Christchurch as the Commission's mostly sole structural engineer during the Canterbury earthquake sequence. I inspected and assessed damage to some 1,500 residential buildings, from detached dwellings to multi-storey apartment buildings, and I reviewed files on another 1,000 properties or buildings. On 6 August 2010, Neil Taylor, the then Chief Executive Officer, instructed me to undertake a seismic assessment of the Council's Civic and Administration Centre building. The Darfield earthquake delayed my review, but on 6 January 2011 I submitted my report and design calculations to Mr Taylor. In short, I assessed the main office building at not less than 100% of New Building Standard, or NBS, for current earthquake design loadings, and I found that the council chambers had some structural limitations, so I recommended that it should be strengthened or demolished within 20 years. I was in Christchurch in the immediate aftermath of the fatal earthquake of 22 February 2011. In reply to an inquiry, this still cracks me up. In reply to an inquiry from Mr Taylor on 5 April 2011, I reported on my inspection of buildings in the Christchurch city centre. I also reported that I'd re-inspected the stairwells in the council building, and I confirmed that my earlier report was still valid in the light of what I had seen in Christchurch. My report was reviewed by a review panel of 3 engineers. After receiving comments from them on 26 April 2011, I responded to points they had raised and I offered to meet with them. We met in August 2011 with Messrs Taylor and Bryden, the then Chief Building Inspector, in attendance. Mr Taylor summarised our discussion in an email. I responded that I understood they had confirmed that my assessment calculations were accurate for both the gravity and earthquake forces, but their main criticism seemed to be that I'd done handwritten calculations rather than producing computer printouts. In reply to a letter from the Council's Property Support Officer on 11 August 2014, 3 years later, I summarised my findings and I attached copies of my earlier correspondence to that letter. Strata Group produced a detailed seismic assessment report dated 16 June 2017. I obtained a copy of that on the 27th of June that year. The report assessed the council building at 10% NBS, identified it as an earthquake-prone building, and recommended structural strengthening or demolition be undertaken within 7.5 years. While the strata report contains many pages of computer-generated and handwritten calculations, I cannot find a figure that shows the level of earthquake horizontal force that they applied in the assessment. This is a fundamental issue that I have with the strata report. Without identifying the level of horizontal force that a new building of the same style would now be designed to resist, it is impossible to state what percentage of that horizontal force would cause the building to collapse. Strata put that figure at 10%. Strata appear to have identified 2 columns that are expected to fail in an earthquake. In an earthquake, it's the more rigid walls that will absorb the bulk of the earthquake forces, and it's only after they have yielded and deflected sideways by significant distances that the flexible columns will be called upon to resist horizontal forces. The strata assessment appears to reverse this sequence of structural failure. In my design calculations, I had supplied a seismic coefficient of 0.72, which equates to a horizontal force that's 72% of the calculated weight of the occupied building. If the building is assessed at 10% NBS as determined by strata, that means it will be likely to collapse when the horizontal force is only 1/10 of this value. Based on my sorry, I'm not talking fast enough.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You're fine to continue, Graham.
Thank you. Based on my calculations, this would occur at a seismic coefficient of 0.072, or about 7% of the building weight. That's a very low level of earthquake shaking. It's about the level of shaking that might cause some cracking in wall linings in buildings and may cause some brick chimneys on houses to break off at roof level. Since the council building was completed in 1968, there have been a number of earthquake events that have caused at least that level of shaking in Napier. These include earthquakes in 1980, after which I was first engaged by the Earthquake Commission, the 2 Weber earthquakes of February and May 1990, and a more recent event in 2008. From my observations during numerous visits to the council building, I do not recall having seen so much as a crack in the wall linings that might be attributed to any of these earthquakes. If the strata assessment is valid and if the council building is only good for 10% NBS, then I consider that it should have suffered very serious structural damage and might have collapsed during at least one of the earthquakes that have occurred in the past 50 years since it was constructed. If the council's civil and administration building is to be demolished, then I submit that the decision should properly be made on good grounds from a fully informed position. I believe that my reports and findings should be part of that discussion. The citizens and ratepayers of Napier need to be sure that if their money is going to be spent on demolishing this building, then it needs to be done for the right reasons. If the building was correctly assessed in 2017 at 10% NBS, the perimeter of the site should have been secured then, so that the public was not exposed to unnecessary risk of injury or death if the building were to collapse in an earthquake. I might add, I walked around it 2 days ago and was actually able to walk around and touch the building. If it really is as dangerous as is claimed, it should have been fenced off in 2017.
Thank you very much, Graham. Do we have any questions from councillors?
Yes, thank you, Graham. Oh, sorry, is it me? You assessed the building originally in 2011 under the NBS, the new building standards. Have those standards changed at all? Was there any, people say things changed after the Christchurch earthquake. Are the standards more rigorous or are they the same?
Well, the outcomes from both the Christchurch and Kaikoura earthquakes is that the MBIE has produced a very comprehensive document which is for the seismic assessment of existing buildings. Frankly, all it does is remind engineers what they should have been doing all along. Nothing has changed. My assessments of buildings that I've carried out under the MBI document are no different from what I did in this project. And that's one of the reasons why I want to go into my background a little bit. I've been very fortunate right through my entire career from university, having been at the forefront, not following along behind. And I have no issues, and I have also verified since, and I'll do it again now, and I've done it in this submission, that my report still stands.
Councillor Price.
Just one question. You referred to 3 earthquakes that have happened that should have damaged it, I guess you're saying. Was there any damage to any other buildings in the city area from those earthquakes?
Well, 4 actually earthquakes. I said 1982 and 1990 and one in 2008. On all of those occasions, each of those occasions, the 1980 was my first engagement with the Earthquake Commission, or Earthquake More Damage as it was at the time. I would have looked at, and this is stretching the memory, probably somewhere around 50 buildings, including broken chimneys and damage to buildings. 1980 there was a house on the corner of George's Drive that was severely damaged. A wall fell out, a double-skin brick wall, and I was involved with restoration of that house, and it still stands straight and true today. 1990 I was actually, for the May earthquake, I was at the family farm in Southern Hawke's Bay, about 15 kilometres from the epicentre. I did probably 300 or 400 inspections right from Dannyverken south through to Napier, and that event, and both of those events, between them they would have generated probably another 50 to 100 assessments here. The majority were around Waipukurau and south. The 2008 event was one off of Waimarama Ocean Beach area, and from that it came literally a year after, or just on a year after the big Gisborne earthquake, Boxing Day I think it was, 2007, and again I would have looked at a similar number of buildings in this area and seen similar damage, with chimneys falling and internal damage and etc.
Yeah, so what I was more after was in the city area, were there any other buildings damaged in those earthquakes? You're saying this one didn't get damaged. Yeah. I was wondering if any did get damaged.
I didn't see any commercial buildings out of that. They usually come through the insurance companies rather than Earthquake Commission. I don't recall having to inspect any buildings that were damaged in either of those events, of the commercial or modern residential buildings. They were mainly older buildings and brick walls, brick chimneys and damage to brick walls and the like.
Councillor Bosman.
Hi Graham, thank you very much for your submission to us. I suppose my question is a process one around how a council can be presented with a report that is peer reviewed also. Obviously, bar one, we're not all engineers, so being able to decipher information like this, you rely on engineers and experts like yourself. So my question is, being that council has a more recent report and that being peer reviewed in support, I'm just wondering where the breakdown in that process has happened so that I can understand that.
Well,
in your view.
Perhaps the first thing I need to do is to clarify, if you're saying peer review of the strata report, there is, to my knowledge, a peer review of the strata report by Oricon.
Yes.
Is that what you're describing?
That's what I'm...
That's on the Napier City Library building. It has nothing to do with and does not in any way, shape or form mention the civic building.
So the process breakdown is that it hasn't been peer reviewed, that building.
Well, I don't know, maybe somebody's sitting on that, but I asked for and obtained earlier this week a full copy of the building and property files from the Napier City Council records, and I didn't find any such peer review reports. Interestingly, I didn't see the Strata Group reports there, although I had received those a couple of weeks after they were issued in 2017.
Right, thank you.
So just to clarify that, you didn't find the strata reports on the property file for the Civic building?
They didn't come in the stuff that came to me this week,
Okay.
but I already had them, so that wasn't a problem for me. I did find, though, the 2 sets of copies of my reports to Neil Taylor. The first series are in sequence in a file that is a standalone document or bundle, which is described as the earthquake-prone... Sorry, I do have a bit of paper here. The earthquake-prone correspondence is one of the files that I received with the council bundle earlier this week, and that does include both the original set of my report calculations and correspondence with Neil Taylor from 2011, and it also includes a sequence of correspondence from my letter to the Property Support Officer at the Council of 11 August 2014, where I again reiterated that my report stood, and attached to that were copies of my earlier reports, and the Property Support Officer forwarded those on to go to the Chief Building Inspector, Malcolm Smith, with a request that they be placed on the appropriate planning file. So there's a clear paper trail there. I have no difficulty with that, but I do have a difficulty with some of the limitations of information that I received that I think is probably pertinent to your discussions.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Just a further point following on from Deputy Mayor Brosnan, the peer review system. So your original reports were peer reviewed by?
By 3 engineers, and the late Graham Harrison from Graham Harrison Consultants, it was originally Powell Fenwick, by Jeff Kell, and by another engineer whose name slips my mind at the moment. I can give it to you. I think she was from either LHT or Strata Group, I'm not sure which. And they peer reviewed mine and came up with, I think in Neil Taylor's words, rather a passionate response to my report. I get passionate when I think about Christchurch, but when I'm dealing with these sort of things, I try and stay clinical.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. That was really enlightening and really impressive to see your background in engineering in this space. So I'd like to just sort of flesh out or kind of clarify your exact problem, one of your main problem with this report. So this seismic coefficient of 0.72, that's a number that is used to represent the size of an earthquake. Is that right? And
Yes.
Then what you're saying is in the strata report you couldn't find any figure that was actually representing the size of an earthquake.
Well, I may have overlooked it, but I can't find a specific number quoted there. Perhaps the best I can do is say that I did telephone the chartered professional engineer who was responsible for the Strata Group report and called into question my concerns about these 2 points of issue.
Mm-hmm.
He was unable to recall or unable to give me, I don't know which, any seismic coefficient. I told him that I'd use 0.72, and as I recall it, his words were, "That sounds about right." That being the case, in the absence of any other evidence, I really don't know where we go from here. Without finding that number, if somebody can find it, I mean, I have again rigorously read this report, as I did several times before telephoning him, and I certainly cannot find a figure. It seems to be plucked out of the air from what I can see, but if it was around the 0.7 that he used, then the assessment I still stand firm has flaws.
I was just gonna, do you think it would help to explain where the 0.72 comes from, or is it a regional thing? or-
Okay. Engineers are number crunchers, and we pretend to be highly accurate. But it's, I'm sorry, I almost used a word I shouldn't have. It's probably over faking the figures that we use and the accuracy that we use. But in broad principle, I can explain. We start off with a basic assessment of the ground shaking that comes from the soil profile, and that puts it into a category, and in this case it was a category C of, there's A, B, A's rock, B's firm ground, C's like this, and D is deeper soft soils. I put it into C, and that's straight away a qualitative assessment that makes about 10% or more variation in their outcome figure. The most important ones then are to look at the performance of the building. A tall, flexible building takes a long time to sway back and forward. A short, rigid building has a very short cycle time. And when you look at earthquake shaking, the slower the shake back and forward, the lower the forces that occur. Sorry, this sounds terribly complicated. The key thing, though, is I then looked at the building and said, this is a civil defence site, and so that puts it into an importance level 4. So instead of using a factor of 1, it immediately goes up because it's a civil defence base and needs to be designed for a higher safety. I put a factor from memory of 1.4. So I've thumped it up, the seismic shaking that I'm using in my assessment, by 40%. What happens then? From that, and an assessment of the style of building, whether it's a floppy, flexible, ductile posts, those are the posts that flex back and forward without collapsing, or whether it's short, rigid walls that are going to rattle and then get cross cracking in them. And I think you will have all seen photos from Christchurch of brick walls with horrendous cracks from side to side between windows, and the buildings are at the point of collapse. So a rigid building that's got no reinforcing gets these terrible sideways cracks in it. If it's got heavily reinforced, a wall like that over there, you know, any of the walls around us become shear panels, and you know, they take a heck of a lot of sideways pull before they finally collapse. But that means that they also then, because they're not flexing, they attract more force. So I used a conservative attraction of force into the building because of its shape and characteristics. And then you number crunch all this, and it comes out to 0.72. It might be 0.7, it might be 1 that I should have used, but it's of that order. That is a sustainable and valid way of assessing it in terms of the New Zealand or Australian New Zealand standards and the New Zealand standard, which is specific for earthquake stuff. And that's your starting point for the assessment. In a case like the council building, I worked out the weight of the building, the tonnage, well, if we talk the tonnage of the building, and in this case, I can't remember the total amount, but I think I got to 2,400 tonnes. Oh no, I got to 3,200 tonnes. And then I put a 2,400 tonne force sideways on it. Yeah, that's the sort of numbers that you're working with. They're huge figures. And then I went through and analysed, well, I need that wall and I need that wall over there. And that gives me all that I need in the way of strength. There are supplementary and secondary walls that I haven't even incorporated into my calculations. But once you get to 100%, you know, you stop. Now that's the procedure I use, and it is the procedure that's, I believe, the correct way of assessing a building under the 2017 MB guidance. Now bear in mind that the MB guidance itself was being developed immediate aftermath of the February 22nd, 2011 earthquake. I was involved in a lot of discussions with MB people, with EQC people, with engineers, and we were actually working on developing, how to design buildings to go. My involvement was more peripheral because I really was rather busy with the stuff I was doing for EQC. But I still had input there, and engineers that I'd been actually mentoring were more heavily involved than I was in that, particularly some of the very bright engineers who were contracted through to do the remedial works on residential buildings in Christchurch. So I was mentoring them, and so I did have some input into this. And bear in mind, I'm not just doing houses. I'm doing one of the buildings I had to assess was the tallest building remaining after the quake.
Sorry to interrupt, Graham, but just bring this back to that
sorry.
coefficient question. No, that's fine. It's all very useful information. So essentially, what you're highlighting is that this coefficient number, in your experience and with your professional background, is a pivotal part of any report and assessment, and that is missing from the strata report. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yes.
That's if you're doing the static analysis. There's another one which is a dynamic analysis, but that takes hefty computer stuff. But unless you work out what coefficient, what sideways push you're going to put on the building, you can't tell whether it's going to survive that or not. And if it's going to collapse earlier, then you actually find out at what level it's going to collapse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will just close us down now. I'm sure Graham is available for councillors to contact outside of the meeting if you have further questions. Is that okay with you, Graham, if councillors were to contact you with any questions they might have?
Yes, absolutely, and that's, you'll find that my contact details are on the bottom of my the introductory page, and also my CV
Great.
that's attached to the report and submission. But thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to put this. If it's only for balance, I don't expect it changes anything, perhaps in some minds, but if you make the decision on the right grounds, then that's the best. That's all I can do is try and help you with that process.
Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, we were to have a presentation from the Zero Waste Network. Is there anybody here that... very good. Welcome. Welcome.
Hi.
You're free to,
I'm Emma Clutch, so I work with the Environment Centre. I dismantle e-waste. So then I'm the coordinator of the recycling program at the Peterheads school.
Kia ora, ko tae tōku ingoa. I'm the kairahi for Parakore, so I work with whānau in Ngāti Kahungunu towards zero waste. And I'm here also representing Ngāti Kahungunu and all of our babies. Our baby, so she's here for us to think about the future.
welcome.
So we've got a presentation that was provided by Parakore. Basically, zero waste organisations oppose incineration. So I've got a sheet that I can distribute. I've got a few copies of this. It's got notes and data on it, and it's got working links. So that's been emailed to Sherry Ball. So yeah, that'd be cool. I'm not actually going to go into a lot of the data, which is probably what you're interested in, but all of that stuff already exists and it's easy to find. So on the next screen, yeah, that's possible. Back one. Yeah. Oh, is it here? Okay. All right. So I'm not sure how much engagement Napier Council has had with proposals for incinerators or considering incinerators. So I would think that we would need a sustainability framework to assess industry options to a waste problem. So that would have an operational aim, some principled aims, and I would think like a risk assessment grid. So I haven't included this document in the presentation, but I've got a copy of it here, but that's basically the framework I'm working from. So an operational aim could be sustainable industry would be resolve systems with controlled risk. So what we can see here is that we've got biological and technical waste streams. So biological waste streams are not carbon neutral unless they're looping in a regenerative system, so they need to be looping. So technical waste streams are finite, they're not renewable, so that needs to be a reversible system. So for our sustainable industry to be resolved, it needs to be looping or reversible. And our primary barrier to that is commingling of waste streams, particularly biological and technical waste streams, or food and plastic largely. So if we move on. Oh, you can. Sorry. Yeah, so but what I would say is that for a sustainability framework over projected over a time frame, then we would have immediate assessment of risk. So that would be over a framework from issues across a procedural pathway. We're talking about supply, processing, distribution, deployment, and disposal. So if we apply that to incineration across waste streams, across issues, the issues are going to be cost, contamination, and then health safety risk and ecological degradation. So Tyne has more knowledge than me about those specific risks.
Yeah, so following on from that corridor, what this image doesn't show is, or really highlight, is this feeding of the beast, so the supply, feeding of the beast. And the issue with this is that it can only keep going as long as you feed it, so it perpetuates waste in the end. And also, these are such a huge, investment that how they work and the amount of food that they need. They're centralised instead of localised. There's a lot of transport costs, which all of that sort of thing. And so it not only perpetuates waste locally when we're working on it, but they're talking about over in the islands and things like that as well. So it really also undermines efforts to minimise waste in the first place. So there's this thing called greenwashing, just to make you aware, and it's ways to put across false information. And there's some gimmicks and things that they do. So in Europe, in some of these places, they've got in Sweden, they've got a ski field, artificial one, on the roof. There's one that lights up at night time. And the one in Huntly that they're trying to put across the line is a waka, and it's called kaitiaki. So there is a gimmick to appeal to the people, because it's the people and also the councils who are the decision makers who these businesses have to get to say okay. So just to bring that to your attention. We don't agree. We don't agree, obviously. And social media feeds that as well, because you get these little snapshots of good news stories. So just to bring that to people's attention, because really I'm working in behaviour change, and when people start to see things like that, they think, oh, it doesn't matter, we can still buy all the plastic that we need because there's this amazing technology that's just going to solve it. But really it doesn't replace landfills. So at the moment, landfills are they're considered the bottom of the waste hierarchy. Yeah. But actually this is one that's said to be innovative, portrayed as such, but it's really not. Because our landfill system here is adequate for the time being. It's quite a good one, and really we can look at it as a storage of energy that can be tapped into in the future. And so when we invest in infrastructure like this, it really makes us stuck in a time and a consciousness. So for all the changes that the future generations need, we have to be really forward thinking and innovative. And there's stuff coming up, but this isn't it. So just to keep an eye on it.
So what I would say is that immediately we assess risk, and then over the intermediate term, then we affect behaviour change. We send a message. So as households and as organisations, we're going to be doing that reuse and reduce. Over the determinate term, then perhaps a sustainable industry, it's going to be micro level and macro level. But as a municipality on the micro level, then we've got an obligation to install the infrastructure for recycling. On the macro level, we've got legislative change, but we're phasing out problematic material. I would say that we're also enforcing the reversibility of design to capture hard plastic casing for appliances and toys. That's the spectrum of plastic. But then on the mid-level, there is a disconnect, and we, as the council, it could be our responsibility to create the waste minimisation centres that we require to link from the household to macro level industry and governance. So why we're asking, we've got immediate risk, we've got intermediate behaviour change, and we've got determinate term outcomes, and we have operational principles, and that would be then ecological sustainability, economic prosperity, but then social connectedness, I think, would be a principle. Yeah, so we haven't discussed any of the data. We're talking about the risk in processing. There's toxins and dioxins are created, they're carcinogenic. So across ecospheres, there's the cryosphere. It's going to be impacted by landfilling. There's slag. Slag is the solute for a scrubbing process. Then there's filters. So the filters, the slag, and the byproduct are currently need to be landfilled in a secure landfill. Yeah. So then the process itself is less efficient than coal and natural gas. So the product is inefficient. Then the cost of the facility is substantive. Yeah, and there's other questions like that that we would need to ask. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do we have any quick questions?
One quick question, if I might, please, Your Worship. Tane, thanks guys for coming, all three of you ladies.
Yeah.
Could you give me a little bit more around, you mentioned around the impacts of commingled rubbish. Could you speak a little, because we're moving, as you would have been aware, around the changes to recycling and waste within both Napier and Hastings, and there is an element that is commingled. So could you
What do we do
inform us?
with commingled waste? So that if we were to establish an incinerator, what's been advised on the international level is that when you establish an incinerator, you also plan for its discontinuation. So as a part of that process would be asking, what do we do with highly commingled waste? What we do with the circuit boards at the Environment Centre is they get, there's an emerging technology, and it's a company, it's Mint Technology, and then they grind it and they dissolve it in a solute. So at the end, we've still got a solute. And it's a technical and it's an economic pathway to create those solutions. It's an emerging technology. So I think that the worst case scenario, it's a solute.
Yeah. We think in really different ways, so that's an awesome way to put it from your perspective. For me, in the way that I think, separation is really important. Once you mix everything together, it becomes rubbish. But if you keep it separate, it's a resource. So what we work to do is to change people's consciousness. So instead of this idea that it's a waste, looking at it as a resource. And so when you mix it, it becomes rubbish, particularly with food, because it's associated with all the things that we think of waste, smell and rotten and dirty. If you clean your recyclables and sort it, it's not paru, and we can take away that and we can start to value it again.
But that's where we create jobs. In a waste minimisation centre, then we would mobilise a volunteer workforce, we'd create employment, and we could generate local solutions as well. But that would help also to diffuse behaviour change in the community. And it's having separation at the site of deposit. Yeah, which is actually really hard with a group of school kids, and it takes a lot of effort to separate at deposit.
Yeah, and just one thing on jobs, because that's one of the big things, ASAT's going to create jobs. So that's for councils that are trying to employ their people, that's a huge seller. But I just think we're at a time where instead of looking at how many jobs and being sort of like taken aback by that number, because it changes everywhere, they're very vague. They just throw out this number that will impress you. And they're not necessarily local jobs, they might get people from overseas to come and build it or something like that. And that we need actually meaningful jobs, not just lots of jobs, but meaningful ones for the overall well-being of people. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was very informative. And again, are you happy to be contacted by councillors if they did have
Yeah,
any
like the
further
sheet I've
questions?
distributed, what I said that I emailed that to Sheree
Great.
Scribble, and so it's got links on there and it's got our emails too. And I revised the Zero Waste Network specifically for incineration. They've got a document which advises the specific questions you need to be asking if you were considering an incinerator. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You can find me on Parakuri on our website.
So now moving on to announcements by the Mayor, which I don't have any formal announcements, but you will see that we've got an addition to our agenda around discussion of minor matters. So just calling for any minor matters that you may have, and we'll make a note of those and discuss them at the end of the meeting. Bearing in mind that these cannot be anything significant and there cannot be any decision or recommendation associated with it. It is just to really bring up minor matters and use the opportunity to have a discussion around them. None today? Very good. Oh, Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
I will just put on an update from Councillor Price and I on the Waipariki project.
Goodness. Do we have any announcements by management? And confirmation of the minutes of the ordinary council meeting held on Tuesday the 19th of November 2019. Do I have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Bogue, seconded by Councillor Taylor. All those in favour please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. And on to our first agenda item for the day, which is of course our Stormwater Bylaw 2020, which we held the hearings for at our last council meeting. So we now have the bylaw back, and some changes have been made in light of our debate and discussion from our previous meeting, and we have Cam here to perhaps give us just an overview of the changes that have been made, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And Mr. Kingsford as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Worship, Deputy Mayor, Councillors, ladies and gentlemen. From an environmental point of view, the establishment of this more stringent bylaw, Stormwater Bylaw, is a very important step towards improving the water quality discharge to the coastal environment. Once it has interacted with human-induced contaminants through the activities that we all carry out within the Napier City boundary. This is just one piece of the environmental puzzle for Napier. And in conjunction with our stormwater quality education campaign, of which this is part of, which you're all aware of, this industrial stormwater working group, which we facilitate through the relationships we build with ratepayers, iwi community groups, polluters, and those with industrial processes, and the ongoing work that we carry out within all of the urban waterways to assess, rectify, trace, and plan for the future. I'm confident that this amended bylaw with concurrent environmental workflow will enable significant improvements to be made to our environment over time. This paper asks for adoption of the amendments made to the Stormwater Bylaw following full public consultation, which exceeded the requirements of the special consultative procedure, taking into account that public feedback and making further amendments to it. The key of this proposed Napier Stormwater Bylaw 2020 is to ascertain a balance between viability for the community and for individuals to make improvements, and also affecting a continual improvement, especially for Te Whanganui a Orotu, the Ahuriri estuary. I believe we've enabled this balance, but must note that it would be very undesirable not to turn off the pollution, which we currently have within the city, which may result in us having very similar conversations in 15 to 20 years' time. So it's an important step to making positive change. Subsequent to receiving public feedback, 4 main amendments have been made, which are included within your paper. The first of which is the lead-in time for affected industries. So The enactment of the bylaw will not be immediate, is the proposal. It will become enacted on the 1st of February to give some time. Following that, there will be an assessment by environmental officers, and that will be based on the risk of the industries, any pollution responses that we initiate to those particular addresses, not only industries, and other information that we receive from the public. That will then create a need to provide an environmental management plan, which will basically be a blueprint for those facilities and those industries to work towards continual environmental improvement for those. The word public was a second amendment proposed. In most instances, stormwater from a private system does interact with the public system at some point on its way out to the estuary or the coastal environment. So the term stormwater network is the generally accepted term, regardless of what sort of ownership it is in, because we have to push responsibility upstream and up the pipes. Additionally to that, third amendment is taking a staged approach for non-compliance with the conditions of an approval. There was concern that we could swing in and suspend an approval for connection from a site to our stormwater network. We won't be doing that with immediate effect. There will be steps which are now presented within the bylaw itself. And the fourth amendment is a clarification for the definition of approval, and that has, subsequent to the HBRC submission, has included an advice note stating that the stormwater bylaw refers to stormwater managed by Napier City Council as such, and should they have a direct connection to the environment, then that is a Hawke's Bay Regional Council issue, and particular requirements will be sought from HBRC. Therefore, we arrive at the officer's recommendation that Council confirm that the bylaw is the most appropriate form to address what we have occurring in the city, that the Stormwater Bylaw 2020 be adopted following its further amendments, and that Council authorise officers to notify submitters and the public that the bylaw has been adopted, should that be the case.
Thank you very much. One quick question from me, just with regards to the lead-in time, because that was sort of something raised by business owners in terms of costs associated with them becoming compliant. So through the process of actually preparing their environmental management plan, which Council will support them through that process, you feel that that will adequately address their concerns about having enough time to put in place what they need to put in place to meet the bylaw requirements?
I do, absolutely. I believe that we're not going to change things overnight. This is a long-term journey. We've come on a long-term journey to get to the position that we're at. It will take time to make the correct amendments, and there will be some investment required in that. So the expectation is not that it happens immediately and on the 2nd of February we're out waving sticks around, but we will work with people to a degree to enable environmental improvements to happen at each of those sources of contamination.
Thank you. Councillor Price.
Further to that question, would you be able to give us a rough example of a timeline that you may work with a car company that specifically came out? I know it's a tough one, but we're gonna pass a bylaw, and we have questioned some areas, and then a week later we're gonna just go with it.
Sure. Through you, Madam Chair, the time frames will depend on the scale, the intensity, the concentrations of contaminants coming off any particular site, and not just focusing on car yards. However, some of the environmental management plans that we have received for industrial sites that are quite complex are looking out towards the 5-year time frame. Some organisations have to go to a board to seek funding, so they want to do that over a period of time. What we're looking for is low-cost quick wins. Some solutions that we've heard of cost a gas bottle and a bag of sausages for the people to incentivise staff to come back and do a little bit of extra work to make some slight amendments within their sites. But then there will be ongoing investment and potentially significant investment in some sites where they may have legacy issues with the type of site that they are occupying. They may have a series of potentially increasing pollutants on that site that need addressing. So it's all about putting the controls in place, being reasonable, but not being too reasonable that we're still having these conversations in many years' time. So it's about finding that balance between the economics of it and the environmental outcomes. And if anybody wants to use the estuary for recreational purposes, for collecting kaimawana and that sort of thing, then we need to be seen as leaders in this and driving positive change within the environmental space.
Councillor Bogue.
Thank you. If one of the purposes of this bylaw is to reduce the contaminants that go into the estuary, is there any way we can measure if it's successful or not? Do we have any data on that?
Yes, we can, but it's a multifaceted approach. So with the bylaw coming into force on the 1st of February, if we took a baseline of water quality at that point and checked again on the 1st of February the following year, there's going to be all sorts of other parameters that come into that through education, through enforcement, through all number of land use changes within Napier that could skew the results of that. So there's no particular test that will show that this particular bylaw has had a positive impact on the environment, but that's about the concurrent work that we're doing and a cumulative effect of all of that actually making a difference over time, rather than focusing on the one particular tool in the arsenal.
Through you, Madam Mayor, if I could just add to what Cameron said in response to Councillor Price's question. The environmental management plan approach is something that we've implemented through our Thames Pandora consent as a condition of consent, and that's been quite successful. It does take a risk-based approach, so looking at the higher risk activities to stormwater contamination first and foremost, and within those environmental management plans that are owned by the business or the property, they're identifying the risk that they present to the matter and identifying what they're going to commit to in order to manage their risk, including the timeframes at which they might be able to implement those. So one, there's the process of working through that risk assessment for the high risk activities. Then there's the process of the development of the environmental management plan, the commitments made within those, and then the timeframes around delivering on those commitments. So there is quite a bit of time associated with all of those steps in the process. The other aspect of that I think is worth noting is the resource availability within Cameron's team to undertake that process. So obviously we can cover across more activity and assess more activity with more availability. It's worth noting in regard to that they have a very, very busy program with all that they're trying to do in terms of, one, ensuring our own compliance with consent conditions, but also looking for those value-added opportunities that they've been tasked with in improving stormwater quality and environmental outcomes at Napier.
Thank you. Councillor McGrath.
Just a few questions. Kim, do we have baseline recordings for the estuary currently that we can make comparisons with in the future?
We have baseline recordings, sorry through you, Madam Chair, we have baseline recordings for the urban waterways, which is what we have the biggest influence over. We do have some recordings, particularly during the onset of rainfall within the estuary, but to a degree that's out of our jurisdiction. So it's the urban waterways that we'll be focusing our energy on to ensure that they're the cleanest they can be when they enter the estuary.
So I guess the point there through you, Madam Chair, is that once our discharges reach the estuary, and excuse the pun, the effectiveness of what we might deliver becomes diluted by anything coming down from upstream, which is the part that's out of our jurisdiction. Yeah, bit of a flow-on effect.
Just a few more there. Between now and February, everyone tends to go on holiday, and we've been caught out before in a courtroom with this sort of time period and expectations. Are we being realistic here? I mean, we're saying we may not chase things, but what's the perception going to be like out in the public, do you think?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think the perception out in the public is that we need to be seen to be doing our best for the environment, and the bulk members of the public want to be able to have an estuary that is swimmable and has great amenity values and cultural values which are supported by this sort of step. Is the 1st of February reasonable? I believe it is. We're not expecting a massive step change on the 1st of February. There is already a stormwater bylaw in place to offer some protection, which people need to be aware of. And so I do think it's reasonable. There is no scientific reason why I can think of choosing another date which will provide any further benefit.
Just following on from that, about walking the talk, is council ready for this? Our own teams, such as the way we weed spray, the way we clean footpaths, the way that we have our windows cleaned in our buildings. Are we actually going to meet this bylaw ourselves by February?
Through you, Madam Chair, I believe we're on the right direction, as is most other organisations within Napier. We are quite a significant part of that puzzle, with grass cutting, with weed spraying, with pipe flushing. There's all sort of manner of activities that we carry out as a council as part of our core duties. It's an ongoing road of continual improvement. There are a plethora of SOPs now required to flush pipes, for instance, to make sure that they're dechlorinated, to catch any sediment that comes out. All of these are steps towards betterment within the environment, and there's a huge awareness within some of the internal education that I've carried out throughout the different parts of council to enable, or so that the staff feel enabled to do the right thing in this perspective. And we're all on a journey, and council is definitely part of that. And we've already seen quite significant improvements in the way people think about the downstream effects of what they're carrying out during their workdays.
And through you, Madam Chair, just to add to what Cameron said, council aren't perfect. There's no doubt about that. But we do have an approach of continuing to look at what we can improve on, what we can do better, and I'd say that in this respect, that applies to our activities and how they might impact on stormwater. So, are we ready? Well, we're ready to embrace that challenge. Are we perfect? No, we're not. But I don't think that we should delay the adoption and action of this bylaw until we are perfect. That day will never come.
I'd hate to think we'd be the first ones prosecuted.
So just further to that, do we actually have a formal process where we're pulling together a work program to identify what we do need to be changing within our own environment, our own council procedures?
Through you, Madam Chair, look, that is something that we definitely need to do. And so we have not started that yet, but equally, if we had started that, we would not have been able to enact that by the time this bylaw becomes enacted. That is a program of work. There may be some quick wins in that, and that's what we really need to look for first. We have a very, very busy work program, and that's a prioritised work program. So if that's something that becomes a higher priority, then we would do that quicker. But we'd also have to reflect on what we'd be putting down in order to deliver that. So would that deliver any more benefit by 1 February? Could we push out that 1 February date to allow us to do more of that work? Those are all options. I guess we've got to look at what the unintended consequence of not doing other work to be able to deliver that by a certain time frame would be.
perhaps if we could just make an action note there
Absolutely.
to look at that
Yeah.
in terms of the other priorities that you have on your plate. Thank you. Councillor Tapani.
Thank you, Your Worship. Great work, guys, and I've received a lot of confidence even from your statements today. I was looking for opportunities around where we would get to work with our residents during this transition period, but the detail you've given around how you're going to be working with the commercial sector, I hope is an indicator around how we're going to put together a program of information and engagement with our residents to take them on this journey, which includes the shared responsibility with Hawke's Bay Regional Council and perhaps inviting people such as Tane, who was here earlier on, from the behavioural specialists and waste, etc., etc. So there's a huge opportunity for us to build on the fantastic work you've done already. My question is, in the bylaw with regards to one of the changes that were made, and this was with non-compliance with conditions of an approval, you've inserted quite a large paragraph there around C, which says, following further non-compliance with items and conditions of an approval after the above steps have been taken, council will base discretion on the seriousness of impacts of that non-compliance prior to me. So, so my question is, guys, could you give me an idea of what is the criteria we're using for measuring seriousness, and what are the impacts that we're also measuring and looking for?
Oh, certainly good question, through Madam Chair. It's very much at an officer's discretion. The seriousness will be measured scientifically, so there may be a non-compliance due to quantity of stormwater coming out of a pipe, for instance, which is not as serious as long as it doesn't cause scouring and flooding issues downstream. That's not as serious as a discharge of wastewater from an industrial process going into the water network. So this is mainly focused on the quality of our urban waterways, and therefore where there is a huge plume of stuff that is not stormwater coming into a place that has an approval, which would be a breach of that, then we will take that very seriously.
I've got another question, but if I can find it first, I know that Councillor Wright.
Councillor Wright.
Hi, Cam. I know I've discussed this with you privately, but just to reassure the public, like, let's say a fictional Jim, he's out washing his car, he's not washing it in the way that we feel is appropriate for our stormwater. Maybe his neighbour doesn't like him and rings in and says, hey, Jim's washing his car and he shouldn't be doing it. We are going to take an educative approach to this, aren't we? So the Environment Police aren't going to rock up and slap a big fine on him or something like that. It's going to be an educative approach where we try and educate people to change their behaviour. Is that correct?
That's correct, through Madam Chair. We do have flashing lights and a sheriff badge. However, with that sort of thing, we will be following an educative approach first. With everything we deal with customer complaints within council, we have occasion to come across that sort of a situation, and that relates to everything from water conservation, someone watering their lawn, to not putting their recycling out right. We get those calls about the neighbours, so we have methods and ways of dealing with complaints such as that, to make sure there is a reasonableness. But yes, this will predominantly be educative to start with, but where there's recidivism and people blatantly pouring stuff down drains, and we get called to an address on multiple occasions for it following some education, then we do need to step that up to the next phases.
Thank you.
Councillor Tapani, did you find your other question?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Your Worship. One question around, and it's on page, just in case you want to find it. It's a nice easy one, Cam. Page 10 of the agenda with regards to 6.1. My question is around distance. The reference to distance in A, erecting any structure on or over within distance of the public stormwater network. What's that distance?
That's an infrastructure question. I might have to pass over to my
Feel free to
leader
get back
here.
to me.
What that is trying to achieve is is protection of waterways, but also pipelines. So adjacent to a lot of our stormwater networks, we have other infrastructure that could be affected by excavation and that sort of thing. I will get back to you on that one. That's
Cool, that's cool. And a follow-on question is, I know that Hawke's Bay Regional Council have done quite a bit of work around improving water quality in the likes of drains coming off farms and other areas, and some of that science is around tree planting to encourage habitats and better water quality within water channels. Now this is a drain in a stormwater network, but nonetheless life exists in those spaces. So as we go forward, and I'm not expecting by the 1st of February, John, but in the future, will there be a greater alignment to see planting along these spaces, increasing of natural habitats, species, and perhaps an education program that draws in monitoring of the waterways and species in those areas?
Through you, Madam Chair, we must recognise that the primary reason for the waterways, I avoid like the plague the term drain, thank you very much, is for flood conveyance and stormwater conveyance. So a lot of the waterways throughout the city, the waterway themselves is managed by the Regional Council for the purpose of moving water out of the city. For some of the waterways that we have ultimate control over, there is possibility of that occurring, particularly within the Thames and Tyne waterways. There is already a plan in place to look at integrating some plantings into other projects that are happening adjacent to that area. We do need to carry out a bit more science in relation to legacy contaminants coming through from old landfilling that is coming to the surface in those areas, to ensure that any planting that was to occur in those sites wouldn't be wasted money because they then put roots down, hit something nasty and all keel over.
Further to that, through you, Madam Chair, returning councillors might recall a proposal was put forward by a member of the public to undertake significant planting on the cross-country drain. At that time, while we're not against that, to reiterate Cameron's comment, those waterways are in place primarily to convey stormwater, and any planting may affect the ability of those assets to do that. So we've got to look at how, what that capacity is, how we might preserve that, and if there's an opportunity to plant out. So we're not principally against that, but at the point where you're looking to reserve that conveyance capacity, any planting might be purely aesthetic as opposed to deriving any ecological value in terms of stormwater quality. Notwithstanding that, it still might be able to support other ecology as well. So our modelling that we're finalising now will help us to examine those parameters and whether there's an opportunity to plant within the wetted perimeter, if you like, or the area that will be conveying, or outside of that area. But certainly, I believe there will be some opportunity in the future.
So it's more function over form?
Primarily, yes. As you may recall, we've often talked about being able to deliver more than just one outcome for the money that we spend. So overlaying that, yeah, if it's just about amenity value, then we'd like to achieve more than that. But yeah, function first.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Thank you. John, soon as you've raised it, as you may know, the planting of our urban waterways is something I'm particularly passionate about. You mentioned modelling to inform potential options around planting that you're currently undertaking. Is that modelling based on current layouts in terms of topography, slope, that sort of thing of our existing urban waterways, or are you modelling potential changes as well to allow for things like planting of those waterways?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's a big question, and there's many elements to that. Our modelling will be looking at the capacity of our network, piped, open waterways, what have you, to convey certain rainfall events out to discharge to inhibit flooding. So we anticipate that modelling will identify where we will need to upgrade the capacity of our network to be able to meet that requirement. So primarily it's about what capacity do we require. We then may be able to overlay any concepts around how we might beautify or augment those drains, or sorry, open waterways, Cameron, to drive a different outcome. That would be probably a secondary phase of work, if it were.
So what I'm hearing is it starts with an audit and understanding of the current structure of
Yes.
those waterways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll have some capacity requirements. I believe there are some different solutions available in terms of what you're proposing, but it is about the planning and preparation of all of that work to ensure that we're driving the right outcomes for the investment that we might make. And certainly, I believe there will be options, I guess, on the science side, which I'm going to stray into as an engineer, so Cameron will whack me if I'm wrong. But we're looking to understand where our contaminants are coming from, where their sources are, and different contaminants will require different treatment methods to either remove or reduce the impacts of those contaminants on our environment. And so planting may not be the right solution in different parts of our network, and we'll be looking at a from discharge to source approach in terms of where those treatment options might lay, looking to push that responsibility as far upstream as possible and incrementally improving that stormwater quality in the right places as we move down that cycle of water.
Thank you. Councillor Tupney?
Thank you, Your Worship. So, supplementary question to the Deputy Mayors. Sorry guys, this might be a bit of a harder one. On the 27th of November last month, Hawke's Bay Regional Council expressed some concerns around meeting future challenges. A part of that was the calculations used in the capacity of stormwater, etc. networks, and whether or not sufficient consideration has been given to the 1 in 50, the 1 in 10, and the 1 in 100 year rain events, given that climate change is having an impact on that and we're seeing an increase, and that those might end up becoming 1 in 20, 1 in 40 and 1 in 60 rather than 1 in the other converse stats. I'm looking for an indicator from our staff that as we go into this modelling and we look at these various options, that those calculations are a part of the consideration given the changes we're seeing.
Through you, Madam Chair, that's another very involved question, isn't it? Which I'll do my best to answer, and if I miss any element of that, please feel free to remind me. So with regard to return period events, rainfall events, and the influence of climate change on those, we will only know what that influence is as that occurs. So at the moment we have a set of parameters around rainfall events depending on the return period element of that. Our piped network is required to meet a 1 in 10 year rainfall event, so that threshold or that standard probably won't change. It's the amount of rain that might fall in that classification which might change as time goes by, and we won't know what that is until it happens. It is widely recognised that we may have more intense rainfall events in association with climate change. So what we might consider as a 1 in 20 year event may actually become a 1 in 10 year event. We don't know what that means right now. In terms of our overall stormwater network, including our open waterways, the threshold we look for there is a 1 in 50 year event. Part of that overall network includes the overland flow of stormwater. So once our piped network is exceeded, then the general accepted approach is that the overland flow of water would occur, and that will require some inspection through our modelling as well. As I mentioned, we expect our model will identify any shortfalls in capacity across our network, and that will have some work to do there. That will obviously be to our current understanding of what 1 in 10 year and 1 in 50 year events might look like. That is a variable element depending on duration of event that you're looking at in terms of the volume of stormwater that you might have to deal with. The great thing about a network model is that they are alive. So as parameters might change in the future, then we can rerun those models. It's also important to note that when we look at our models, we're not just looking at today, we're looking at the growth that might occur in our city and the changes that might drive in terms of runoff from our developed areas and how that might impact on capacity. So in that regard, there's no point going and replacing a pipe today because it's currently under capacity for our standard development now. We like to build in that forward-looking view so that we spend the money once and do it right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any further questions from councillors? No? Do I have a mover?
I'd like to move.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Brosnan, seconded by Councillor Tapani. Would you like to speak to the motion?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to speak in support of the recommendations. So from my reading of the amended bylaw, thank you staff for all of the work you did in pulling together our discussion after submissions. I think for me it strikes a really good balance between the carrot and the stick, and all regulatory tools need to have both, and this does that well. I think especially with the inclusion of, Councillor Price's lead-in time that was discussed in detail after our submissions. I'm also particularly happy with the definition of best practical option. I think that's really robust. It allows us to not only consider on the ground the sort of financial impacts for our community as they need to move towards compliance with the bylaw, but also allows us to be flexible as technology and initiatives change over time, which is really important in any bylaw that will stand the test of time like this one, I hope will. So I was going to make the point, but it's been made by staff well, that it is just a piece in the puzzle, that our stormwater quality has drivers other than what people put down their individual drains, but that everyone plays a part in what comes out the end of that pipe. I'm also really happy with the certainty that we've given to our community around the process for non-compliance and the use of that education component first. So that's why I'm speaking in support, and thank you for letting me move it, Your Worship. Thank you.
You wish to speak second?
I'll reserve my right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Councillor Price?
Just one quick comment, and it's a quote that's been said to me, and I feel comfortable with it. You're going to educate but not tolerate. And I think that's probably in a word where we're heading, which I think is good. Thank you.
Very good. Wow. Councillor Tapani.
The engineer would note that that is 3 words, not one. Thank you, Your Worship. Cam and John, and to our environmental team, you are superheroes. 3 phrases come to mind: everything but stormwater, time moves on, and balance. So label it an open network, but it still contains life. We are looking to drive consumer and behavioural change within our residents, and I think this is a fantastic platform for us to be able to launch a number of environmental outcomes that this council would like to see achieved, given that environmental excellence is one of our key pillars. So fantastic work there. Time moves on as we transition. The entire city matters, and I wish to signal, as our staff already have, and they've provided confidence, that they'll be dealing with both our commercial sector and our residential sector in a fair, balanced and pragmatic approach. And in that, as I mentioned before, are opportunities for us to expand around how we as a council can engage with our residents in that behavioural shift through running initiatives and programs along our stormwater network and encouraging people to take any rubbish that they find as they're on walks through our green spaces. There are a whole lot of opportunities for us to use the carrot as opposed to the stick, and I would encourage a detailed whakaaro around that strategy, and I look forward to it coming back and touching base with it. This will require more than staff and should be a part of an alignment of communication and strategies which introduce the many aspects of what our staff are doing to bring effect and meaning to our community expressions of we must do better for our environment. That message came very clear and has been over a number of years, but more so in the last election. And I think this bylaw is a great step towards that direction. Everyone needs to be prepared to make behavioural shifts. The less discharge into these areas means better water quality, which has flow-on effects for our residents. I know that some of us might struggle with having to change the way and where we clean our vehicles. However, better water quality means better nurseries in our estuary, better fish in our reserves, more people enjoying those spaces in the absence of stinky or obscene items floating in our water. So really the outcomes for our city are broad and wide, which is why I'm sort of indicating that this is a fantastic platform amongst a whole lot of other things for us to launch stuff on. But I wouldn't be me if I didn't put a bit of a barb in there. So history has allowed, and this is really in regards to the transitioned approach that our staff have enabled for our commercial and business sector. So history has allowed the development of these practices in these cities and industries across New Zealand, where we were allowed to just simply dump our waste wherever we felt the need. That has changed. Those expectations have changed. Those assumptions have changed. They were flawed, they were dated, and we need to encourage, with the carrot as much as with the stick, that businesses today need to reassess how they conduct their operations, and that they too could help lead change rather than respond to our bylaws. So while our council, our staff and our city have made provision for a transition change, it's my expectation that our businesses will reciprocate that good faith with determined plans on how they will meet those changes, on how they will participate in the city's vision, and how they will contribute to the better well-being of our city, our residents and our environment. That's the small barb to our businesses. We recognise that they carry our debt, they employ 90% of our people, and they have huge stress factors upon our commercial operators. And those that have been operating for some time have got the opportunity to transition into this change. If I was to open a business on Thames Street today and build a new structure, I would not have that option. As of the 1st of February, I would have to meet the standards of this new bylaw. Thank you for the bell. Finally, climate change and its impacts we've talked about. The opportunities for introducing new mechanisms as we look at expanding and growing our network to meet future demand, and including rising sea levels and the changes in the estuary, and what we might be able to do in those spaces before the sea reaches, such as wet areas and runoff areas to filter that water so that we can get a better return or better quality of water into the receiving environment. Overall, Cam, John and to our environmental team, fantastic effort. I'm in support of what you've done to date and in support of the recommendations of the officers. Good.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for your support, everybody.
So our next agenda item is the council meeting schedule for 2020, which is obviously adopting our formal schedule for the upcoming year. Welcome Devora to come and speak to this and answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Council meeting schedule. So the Local Government Act allows for the creation of a meeting schedule for as long as a council likes, or as long as they exist, so up to a triennium. We tend to run with an annual meeting schedule for a couple of reasons. One, any longer than that becomes a little bit unpredictable. And two, as you're aware, we're very kindly being hosted for our formal meetings currently by Hawke's Bay Regional Council. That's something that's renegotiated each year, so it's not a permanent arrangement, but we're very grateful for their hosting at the moment. So in terms of creating the meeting schedule for next year, we have met the preferred formal meeting timeframes of the Mayor, and in recognition of other familial and evening commitments that people might have. So moving the formal standing committee meetings to a Thursday morning, as per today. So that will be standard moving forward. And we have maintained the 6-week cycle because that took place in the previous training. That did seem to work well. And we haven't had any feedback to the contrary on that. Something that may be a slight shift is the quarterly and more ad hoc meetings will probably be shifted, if we can, towards a Friday to allow for governance resourcing. And I do need to point out I have placed a question mark next to the indicative Māori hui. That's not to question at all the importance of them or of their existence, quite. But more just that is a conversation that remains to be had between the Mayor and the representative organisations of our mana tangata whenua here, and so it's indicative only at this point for next year.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Just a question. I'm fully in favour of the changed time, and I particularly like the fact that this is being live streamed. I have had some difficulty finding the live stream, the recording on the council website. Have I looked in the wrong place? So if I want to go home and tomorrow watch a copy of this, do you know where it is and if it's easily accessible?
So currently, when the live streaming is taking place, it's running through our Facebook site. After the fact, they're being stored on a YouTube channel. There may be some difficulty at the moment accessing that because we're in the process of changing the channel. So we're working with our fabulous live streaming team on that and with comms to get that set up. So that will hopefully take place in the not too distant future. And we, as you're aware, there were some instances of videoing or live streaming in the previous triennium, and so this channel will incorporate all the historical videos as well, so it will become a data source there once that's up and running.
And will that be on the website or the Facebook page, do you know?
So that's it will be run through our YouTube channel, and the link will have a link through our web page, and probably easiest, I think, from our end to tag that into our meetings and agendas section.
Councillor Tuffany? No?
Yep.
Councillor Simpson?
Yeah, just a couple of questions related to the calendar, the schedule. Obviously the yellow fixed meetings. Will this calendar also demonstrate the external joint committee meetings and others? So we will have to seek somewhere else to find those dates?
So those are held in the internal council calendar that you have access to, but yeah.
And my other question is related to the seminar dates. Obviously these are indicative at this stage. My preference, Madam Chair, would actually be that we insert some meeting-free weeks. We are, after all, entitled to take some time off at times and have a holiday. At the moment, there is, if we are dedicated to our council work, there's no opportunities for us to pick a week and plan a holiday.
Although you can, of course, have...
Apologise.
Yeah, apologise. So, but thank you for raising that, and then we will have a discussion about that. Yeah.
And through you, Madam Chair, I'm happy to speak in more detail to the schedule itself, if that would be useful for councillors, and just in terms of the legend. So as you've pointed out, Councillor Simpson, so the yellow highlights are sort of primary meetings, as it were, standing committees, and also our audit and risk committee, which meets quarterly. The green sections that you can see in the schedule there are the school holidays, so we do try and stay pertinent of where there are potential changes in terms of people's personal schedules there. Seminars, we do have those in between every formal meeting on a Thursday, but there is potential there, say in week 5, if you wanted some flexibility, we could certainly build that in. We are very aware that it's been a hefty work schedule for councillors coming in with the start of the triennium, and we certainly appreciate the amount of time that you've committed, and we are very committed to keeping the seminars as well as meetings as consistent as possible to help you plan around those and work in your other joint committee and external appointment commitments. There will be, as Councillor Simpson has pointed out, the occasional instance where perhaps an external presenter is bound by different timeframes that we'll need to work in with for workshops and some extraordinary meetings. So there is a little bit of flexibility there, but we try and provide as much consistency as possible.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, I'll put the motion. No, I need a mover and seconder. Councillor Tuffany, Councillor Wright, thank you. Councillor Tuffany, would you like to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Wright? No? Councillor McGrath?
Having been on council for the last 5 years with young kids, this is great. We're talking up the child-friendly city. We used to start our meetings at 3 o'clock. when all our kids came home. So to start our meetings at 10 o'clock when school is in and make a few exceptions for school holidays, this is a great leap forward. And that's, I'm just going to leave it at that. It's a great leap forward.
Gone to the moon. Thank you, Councillor McGrath, for that endorsement of the change. If there's no further questions or discussion, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item number 3, elected members' childcare allowance, and it's Deborah again.
Greetings. All right. Through the Mayor, I'll speak briefly to this, and I'll start off with a little bit of context from the Remuneration Authority in terms of this allowance. As most of you will be aware, this is a new allowance which the Remuneration Authority, so that's a national body that sets the levels of pay that can be provided to elected members across the country. So in their 1920 remuneration determination, they created the opportunity for councils to adopt a childcare allowance if they wished. There's been a variety of timeframes across councils in terms of approaching this. A few considered it, or at least gave an indicative position prior to the election. Most are formalising it post-election. Our previous council gave an indicative positive position, and now it's being brought through to you for formal consideration. In terms of, so I have some comments here from Dame Fran Wild, so that the head of the Remuneration Authority, in terms of their thinking in relation to this particular allowance. So it was specifically intended to be part of a wider picture of encouraging diversity of candidates to stand. It's not intended to pay the entire cost of childcare as far as they're concerned, but to create, if a council adopts it, to create enough of a contribution that it encourages, or it works towards that purpose, that it encourages diversity of candidates. For this reason, because as part of the feedback process there were a number of councils that raised, well, should there be a mandatory hourly rate, or how do we handle this? They did decide to proceed with an annual maximum that councils could allocate up to if they chose to adopt it, rather than specifying very pedantically how councils should approach it. But they're very open to the allocation of an hourly rate, and from our sort of anecdotal evidence, most councils are pursuing an hourly breakdown. Just helps everybody with a bit of clarity as to how that's going to be approached and where they've adopted it. Like the excuse me, like the elected members' remuneration itself, it is rates funded. So the Remuneration Authority sets the rates, but they don't provide the money to pay them. And so this, while the childcare allowance does not come out of the partial remuneration pool of councillors, so it is entirely separate to that, it is also rates funded. And just one final point. So there were some questions early on as to why this particular allowance is focused on the care of children, because there are people across the country that are caring for the elderly or the infirm. At this point, because the focus was particularly for them around diversity in candidates, they started with a focus on childcare, but they're certainly not precluding expanding that to the care of others in the community that those of us might be responsible for. So it sounds from their perspective like the start of an ongoing conversation, I think, as to how they can encourage councils to support those that might want to take a lead in their community. So that's the Remuneration Authority. Just a couple of things to note in terms of what's been brought through in the specific report today. So we have tested the water with a variety of councils that we're aware of that have either come to the decision themselves or are working through it at this point. As I've already mentioned, most of the ones that we're aware of to date have set some form of hourly rate. There is a bit of disparity in those, ranging currently in our awareness from $15 an hour to the living wage, which is currently $21.15. In our proposed policy, which is open for your debate, we're sitting or proposing towards the higher end of that at up to $20 an hour. We've provided, because the Remuneration Authority has been relatively flexible as to how councils might want to approach it, we've provided a bit of an outline in terms of how claims could be made. So it's a bit of a process outline really, so happy to discuss that. But it's fairly much in line with a standard expense claim, if you will, that the expenses incurred and paid for and then claimed back or reimbursed. The Remuneration Authorities have stated that pretty much the only reason why they haven't called it a reimbursement is that they refer to allowances everywhere else in the determination, so it's consistency. Yeah. And the third and final point in terms of speaking directly to the report is the maximum. So the Remuneration Authority has stated that councils may not allow for greater than $6,000 per qualifying child per year. Again, that is a maximum, so there is no obligation on councils to go straight to that full. There is a mix in terms of how other councils have approached it, going for the full 6,000, going for not at all, and not adopting any form of childcare allowance policy, or somewhere in between. Where we are currently proposing is in the somewhere in between bracket, and obviously this is open for your debate because you are the people that will be most directly affected by it if you have children. Where we've come to, so we are proposing a $2,000 per qualifying child per year figure. How we have come to that is based on an anticipated number of meetings and seminars, which is the primary sort of formal business, which is where there's can be a level of unpredictability and requirements for childcare. So that's where we've come to that, and we're also aware, I suppose, that there are elements. Look, we believe that this is a positive step in terms of encouraging diversity of candidates, and we're also aware that there are elements of the community that will be receiving similar or less remuneration than elected members that don't get this kind of support. So it's finding a balance for yourselves in the community that you operate in. So the levels that you set for yourselves are open to debate up until that $6,000 per year per child level. Oh, sorry, one final point. I lied. Fourth and final point. Something that's important to remember is that any claims for this current financial year are currently unbudgeted. If you do proceed to adopt to whatever level of allowance for this year, those changes will be incorporated into the 6 monthly forecast, and then provision will be required to be made as part of the annual plan process for the years moving forward. Sorry.
Thank you very
now
much.
I'm done.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Thank you. Less of a question and more of a discussion. As some members may know, I hold a slightly different view on the recommendations. There's part of the recommendations I agree with and part I don't. So just foreshadowing that I would like us as a team to discuss and debate the full Remuneration Authority's recommendations. So just foreshadowing with that with you as the chair. So happy later on to do that. Thank you.
Questions from Councillor Tapani.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just for clarity, can you explain again, you were mentioning around the 2,000 per eligible child per year?
Yep.
And then you mentioned a separate figure of $6,000 maximum.
Sure.
So could you just...
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
So let me go over that again because that's going to be pertinent to the discussion that the Deputy Mayor has foreshadowed there. So the Remuneration Authority, in its determination, when it created the opportunity for this to even be discussed, said that councils may adopt a childcare allowance, but up to a maximum of 6,000 per qualifying child per year. So councils have leeway up till that point, but that's an absolute maximum, so they can't go willy-nilly. What the current proposal is, and open to discussion and debate, obviously, by those that are going to be most affected by it, is that there is a lower proportion in line with, so we're anticipating that there's about 50-ish, give or take, meetings and seminars that one anticipates will be participating in over a year, and based on about that $20 per hour mark, so that hourly rate that we're proposing, it works out at about 2,000 per qualifying child. So it's, you know,
Thank you.
yeah, and it's about and that, and obviously again open to discussion and debate. It's about that rates take balance.
Councillor Crystal, when you're saying $20 an hour, say someone's got 2 children and they have one caregiver looking after the 2 children, do they get the for both or just one? You know, one amount they can claim on?
We probably need to unpick that a little bit in the policy. That's a good question, but if it's one caregiver, that one would anticipate that it's one bill, but at the same time the Remuneration Authority is very clear that you can claim per qualifying child, so as long as the children were both under 14 years of age, then yeah, that would be something that we could unpick as part of the policy and make sure that there's some real clarity there.
Can I ask a qualifying question just following on from that? I believe the wording in the remuneration determination is around providing evidence of childcare money paid. So in response to that, would the question not be you can only claim what was actually paid?
Yes.
Councillor McGrath.
Through the chair. I understand that the government already subsidises childcare. I think it's for, it must be 3 to 6 year olds for 20 hours a week. How does this all fit in with that? Can you double dip?
No.
How does it work?
So the Remuneration Authority in their comments was really clear that they took the WINS provisions into consideration when they were weighing up their annual rates and how this was to be addressed. So there has, and they are aware of approximate rates that tend to be paid across childcare providers. So they've also taken that into consideration when weighing things up. What they don't anticipate, so live-in carers, for example, so au pairs are not anticipated to be covered by this. This is where external providers for that type of thing.
So further to that though, if you were getting someone in on an ad hoc basis within your home, that would still be covered by this.
That's correct,
It's
yeah.
just that
It's just that
full-time.
full-time setting is not.
Yeah. Are there any further questions? Yes. Councillor Mawson.
So sorry, just some clarification on that. You said full-time, that would be full-time in the home?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Simpson.
Chair, just a quick question on the timing around things. While this was being drafted, or this was potentially drafted in your calculations around the $20 an hour and $2,000 maximum a year, were you aware that the base council meetings were shifting to mainly business hours? Was that taken into account in your calculations?
The calculations were run very recently, so yes.
Okay, there's no further questions. Then Councillor Deputy Mayor Brosnan. Got to keep that.
I'll take either. Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor, I do have a motion I'd like us to discuss and debate. So I would like to move, and I have forwarded this on to Cherie, so we'll get it on the board for you, that Council adopts the Remuneration Authority's childcare policy, determination and wording. So that wording is that the policy contain the following guidance and criteria. 1, that elected members are eligible for the allowance only if they are engaged on local authority business at the time of the childcare. 2, that they are the parent or guardian of the child or usually has day-to-day responsibility or care for the child. And 3, that the child is under 14 years of age. The childcare must be provided by someone who, 1, is not a family member of the elected member, and 2, does not ordinarily reside with the elected member. Elected members must provide evidence of the amount paid for childcare. Council must not pay childcare allowances to a member that total more than $6,000 per annum per child. And I'm happy to add in there the addition that, and that all claims for childcare must be made within 90 days of the care being incurred. That's our internal wording. And happy to add in another internal wording around that childcare must not be claimed for more than $20 per hour, maybe per sitter, if that satisfies the discussion. So that's the motion, and I'm quite happy to speak to it when you're happy to hear me.
Do we have a seconder?
I'll second.
Information.
Thank you.
Perhaps that last one again so we can put it up on the screen. Your addition at the end. Just so we know exactly what's in there.
Yes, I was making that up as I went, so it was something along the lines of
the $20 an hour.
Yeah, may not claim more than $20 per hour per care provider. Perfect. Thank you.
Excuse me, through your worship, the Mayor, can we please have some clarification as to what has changed? I can see that 6,000, 2,000, but what difference is in the wording, please?
Yes. This is a full substituted motion, so it is in its entirety there.
Thank you.
But yes, we will get, if Debbie wouldn't mind.
And if I can speak to that, so the standing policy, so the proposed policy matched that of the Remuneration Authority in all ways except the proposed maximum per year. So the primary change in the substitute motion, particularly with the 2 internal additions that have been made in terms of making claims within 90 days, and the up to 20 hours part that's now been added. The substantial change in the substitute motion is meeting a $6,000 maximum per child per year.
And just drawing your attention to the substantial change also being not defining to meeting times only while conducting council business is the wording of the Remuneration Authority. So just to clarify, this is 1 through to 4 is wording directly out of the Remuneration Authority's recommendations. So here's my debate. The Remuneration Authority's role in part is to make recommendations to us like this without prejudice and without political influence. They are there to best promote local democracy. The wording I propose up there is theirs, and it's their recommendation to us as passed into legislation in 1st of July 2019 in the Local Government Members' Determination. Young elected members provide a valuable contribution around this table. This council, having flagged full support for the Remuneration Authority's recommendations pre-election, then saw an unprecedented rise in young Napier candidates stand and some elected. This is a fantastic result, and in part is proof that policies like this remove barriers and are incentives to participation, which is the intention that the Remuneration Authority had. Allowances and remuneration are never easy or 100% palatable decisions. However, there are a range of expenses we have, from mileage to accommodation to meeting fees and honoraria, some of which will apply to individual elected members over a term, some will not. but I implore you to debate and adopt this policy once and do it right, to embrace the well-founded, researched and consulted on remuneration authorities' recommendations. They came to their conclusions after a very robust process. It's easy to make comparisons to our community as employees and as staff. However, elected members are not staff, are not employees. In fact, we're nothing like it. There are long, unpredictable and inconsistent hours. There are evenings, there are weekends, there are short notice positions. We have no annual leave, no sick leave, no redundancy and no job security past an electoral term. Elected representatives are not eligible for a range of employee work and income benefits in this area that staff are, and as you've heard from staff, this was included in the Remuneration Authority's thinking. We are not employees, and this is clear. I've personally had weeks in the last electoral term, I believe there were 3, I went back and looked, where my childcare bill for those weeks was more than my total remuneration for those weeks, and many more weeks where it came close. This wouldn't happen in an employment situation and highlights the difference. The Remuneration Authority agrees that without this allowance, the role has barriers for young elected members' participation, and in particular, lower socio-economic demographics and single parents who are less likely to be able to afford to carry the additional costs and the uncertainties on a week-to-week basis where you may pay to go to work. This policy is also integral not only to elected participation, election participation, but also effective participation without distraction for all elected members, including the affected member once they are elected. This policy will stand long after the personalities in this room have moved on. Let's not leave a legacy of redebating for future councils. The total dollar value of this policy in comparison to our others is low, and although it is rates funded, I believe we can find operational savings in our annual plan discussions we're about to have, so that this will be able to be brought without influencing rates at all. I do not believe this will mean a rates rise. 99% of the policies adopted so far regionally in New Zealand have not adjusted the dollar value from the 6,000 recommended. Indeed, I can only find one, Manawatu. Councils who have already adopted at the 6,000 level include the Far North, Environment Canterbury, Carterton, Christchurch, Northland, Whangarei, Waitaki, Kaipara, all of Auckland and their community boards, and all of the community boards in Christchurch, Wanganui Council, Hamilton, Hauraki, Selwyn, and actually the list goes on. There is a well-debated concept in social equity about the opportunities to build everyone up. It starts with one decision, one step in the right direction, and that by making that step or that decision, it doesn't stop you advocating and still fighting for other equity issues, like the living wage, like fairer distribution of government subsidies, like elder care and disabled persons allowances, or in the case of this change, national childcare initiatives being changed at a staff level for employees. In fact, often change needs something close to launch from. A close example, batting an issue like this down does not build everyone up. So I implore you, as leaders of this city, to have the political courage to support this, because it is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Councillor Wright.
I'm going to speak against the motion. I take a different view on that. I need to be consistent around the lens that I pass over all issues that come before me, and it is one of fairness and equity. I believe that we are considering something that raises us above other people. It suggests that we are special or privileged, more so than our staff and our ratepayers in the community. There are women out there who work long hours, who have to put their children in care, and who do not have this ability, will not have this privilege that we're giving ourselves. And I would, as a ratepayer, if I was in that situation, I would resent the fact that my rates are going to give somebody a privilege that was denied to me. And so I just feel that in the interest, I take a different approach about fairness and equity, and I just think that it needs to be applied across the board, and I don't think that we are any more special or different than any other person in our community, so I will not support the motion.
Councillor McGrath.
I'm going to support Councillor Brosnan's motion for a couple of reasons. And if we go back long enough, you'll find out that councillors didn't get paid. They were no different from anyone else. But we all sit round here and we signed off on getting paid. So I think this is a step we are moving forward. We look around the table and I can think of 6 councillors who this applies to, possibly more. Don't know. But we have to move with the times. We didn't invent this. This was invented throughout New Zealand by the Remuneration Authority, and this is the figure they have come up with. So I'm not going to argue with that. I didn't argue with the figure that they gave me for my income, and I didn't see anyone else around the table this time say, hey, it's too high, I'm not taking it. So I'm going to stick with Councillor Brosnan here and support her on this.
Councillor Mawson.
I also support Deputy Mayor Brosnan. All I'll say is that our childcare, my wife actually has to work for us to pay for our childcare. Now, our childcare is good for the children, so we believe in that. It allows them to socially interact. But as I say, her actual wage goes on our childcare. And I think that the $6,000 is good simply because I did a quick calculation of what we pay per year for our 2 children. As mentioned, it is 3 years old that it starts to count. The government, central government give you 20 hours. But currently Lily, our youngest, is only 22 months. So she is indeed a lot more expensive to have in childcare. And also it's an impact on my wife if she wasn't able to work, because clearly she's an individual that needs to, who is very career focused, thus needs to have a job and work. And that calculation I got to was just under $16,000 a year for those 2 children. That was full time, by the way.
Councillor Tapano.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be speaking in favour of the Deputy Mayor's recommendations. I thought you did well in expounding the depth of research that went into the authority's decision. It highlighted a number of things I hadn't considered, so I really appreciate you providing that data. This is really about, from my perspective, the Remuneration Authority looking independently at our situations collectively across New Zealand, and that we are, in fact, treated differently to our residents, to our employers, and to normal commercial operations. Everything we do is defined and touched on by central government, so there are always elements where we can put in checks and balances around the fact that we as elected members have different expectations, not only from ourselves and our community, but also from central government. So for me, this represents good fairness, good equity, opens doorways for opportunities, increases the number of participants who might consider sitting at this table with us, and I would welcome any opportunity that removes barriers and encourages people to participate in democracy. With regards to comparing ourselves to other residents and other situations, I also hear Councillor Wright's concerns and the perceptions that this does send to our community. I would just like to, from my perspective, offer a little tweak. And that is that I think that the signal is not sent to our residents, but actually sent to our businesses. If the government can see that this is an element that needs to be incorporated in local governance to provide better participation, to provide better equity, and to provide better fairness, My challenge is, why are our businesses not seeing that same value in their staff? And that challenge extends to us all. So I do agree with both. I support the motion as Councillor Brosnan has put to the table, but I also think that the perception that you've identified, Councillor Wright, also needs to be targeted to our businesses who make that decision to their employees and provide their opportunities to be more participatory in their roles. So, nō reira, kama. Kia ora.
Councillor Crystal.
I would like to speak against it. I agree that there should be some remuneration, but as I have been a stay-home mum, a working mum, and have never received any childcare payment, that was my choice. I have taken my eyes at a community level and how this will look, and I don't think that it looks, no one else gets this. I've done extensive research. I've talked to childcare providers who have basically said that it's setting, it's not the norm, it's not what they do. And again, like the 20 hours free childcare, I think we're playing with ratepayers' money here, and I still feel that it's not our money to play with. So I think the 6,000 is quite high, and from what Debbie's told us about the meetings, that the 2,000 will cover what we are expected to do. So that's what I think.
Councillor Taylor, just to let you know, I have decided to suspend standing orders because I think it's important that we do 20.6, I think it is, to enable all of us to have some input into this decision. 21.6?
20.6.
I was right the first time.
Goldfish.
Councillor Taylor.
I too am not going to support this motion, but my reasoning is not around whether it's $2,000 or $6,000. But I would just bring, and I do not personally believe that the previous council's indicative positive position was even known to the community, and that we took a representation review which indicated to us that there would be greater diversity around this table as a result of moving to a full ward system. So the fact that we have a diversity group of people here is not because, I do not believe that it's because people thought they might get some childcare allowance, but that the ward system created that diversity. So until such time, and I appreciate that one step along the way is the first step, but I think of all the other people in the community who have to have care for disabled children over the age of 14, and there's a large number of people who care for others the aged and do not receive any payment for that. So it's not about the money, 2 or 6, it's about the principle, and I support much of what Councillor Crystal has said.
Councillor Crown. I'd also like to speak against the motion. Everyone has covered most of my reasoning, but I'd just like to speak to it because I agree with Councillor McGrath around the fact that we need to move with the times. My uncomfortability here is the amount. I think that moving with the times means that we should allocate a certain level, but that it shouldn't be the 6,000. I think that the Remuneration Authority has given that to us as a tool, something for us to be able to assess and decide. Times have changed, prices have increased, etc. But I also agree with Councillor Wright in that we are no more important than anyone else in our community, and those people that are out there working that aren't afforded this privilege, that it is definitely a privilege, even the fact that we're being allowed to consider this.
So I think that from a ratepayer's perspective, if you have, say, 3 children, it turns into the perception that it is a money-making thing. I'm really aware of that. I think that, I'm just not comfortable with that level there. So those are the reasons why I can't support the motion.
Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, I too, through you, Madam Chair, speak against the proposed amendment particularly. I do agree that we are in a unique position. I myself have previously had dependent children while struggling to meet demands of after-hours duties and on-call alerts and things. So I appreciate what it is. It is a burden to care for your children or ensure that you have good care in place. But I am mindful that staff have put a bit of time and effort into researching approximate actual costs, and I think that on that basis I'll speak against the proposed amendment. And I thank those that can speak more eloquently than I on this matter, but I certainly can't support the current amendment.
I would also like to, I'm reserving your right to speak. I would also like to speak against the substantive motion. The up to is key to me here. So we weren't told that it should be 6,000. We were given the leeway to decide up to a maximum of 6,000. So the recommendation that, the original recommendation of 2,000 per annum per child, to me, strikes a balance between affordability to our community and also providing that potential contribution such as an allowance may make to encouraging further diversity on our council. So I really did feel that for me that struck a good balance. I take on board Deputy Mayor Brosnan's comments about the fact that as councillors we are contractors. However, as contractors we still qualify for the Working for Families tax credit should our combined family income be under the threshold. As contractors, no, we don't get leave, but our salary remuneration or our contractor remuneration actually has those entitlements built into the hourly rate. We are not missing out. I also agree our hours can be unpredictable. However, we're not unique in that regard either, and I'm aware from my many years in the health industry where surgeons, for example, are on call and they have to physically leave their house and they are not receiving any sort of childcare allowance, so they literally have to have someone there in case they get called out through the night. We are not in that situation. Most of our out-of-hours work is either pre-known or a phone call or an email. So I think that the original motion for me strikes a good balance, and for that reason I do not support the substantive motion before us. Councillor Brown, did you wish to now, unless...
Yes, I'd like to say something. Firstly, to Graham's point, was it known by the people? I, for one, knew. I don't know other candidates standing. And when I heard that there was allowance for childcare, I took it as it made me feel welcome to put myself forward as a new mum to be sitting at this table, and I thought that really showed that we would value the perspective of parents in our community, and that we want that voice represented on council, and that we would do what we should do what we could to support them. I also like the way of thinking of we're community leaders, and where we're going to go, others will follow. So just because this isn't the norm, someone's got to be the people who take the first step, and we can be a catalyst for other organisations to follow. The thought that it rises us above other people, I struggle with that, because there's a lot of, almost every employment situation is unique,
And I know ASB, for example, they provide 1 year's full maternity pay for their staff. And do those staff feel that that rises them above other people in the community? I struggle with that way of thinking a little bit. In terms of the fact that we're not providing this other care for people with disabilities and all of the other ones, I think Debbie put it quite well that this is a first step. Social progress is very slow, and we don't gain those other things by shooting this one down, but this can be something that we build on so that care for the elderly and disabled people can come forward as well. The perception that it's money making, I know there are some things around that with like wins and things like that. The numbers never add up. So 6,000 per child would never add up. And I'd also like to put on it, the 6,000 is a maximum. So if we didn't spend $6,000, and it's not full-time care, it's only when we're doing council business, then we wouldn't get 6,000. So if there is only 2,000, so the council's proposal of capping it at 2,000, if that's based off what we think is a reasonable assumption of the amount of work that we're doing, then we'll only be able to claim for 2,000. So I think having the maximum at 6,000 gives us that flexibility. In terms of the numbers in that, it's 50 meetings a year at 2 hours per meeting. We're already well over 2 hours on this. That doesn't include the time that you've got to get your child settled into childcare, travel to the meeting, be here on time to settle yourself into the meeting, go to any debriefs after the meeting, and then go home and pick your child up from childcare or whatever. So the numbers don't add up there. I did a quick calculation, so that was talking about 100 hours of work for the year. We've already done 131.5 hours in the last 6 weeks. So I'd like to just point out that the $6,000, it's a contribution. It's not a Rolls-Royce package that we're rolling out here. Yeah, and I suppose to sum up, social progress is slow, and when we're taking these steps, to me this is the first step, and I liken it to eating an elephant. You do it one bite at a time, but it's prudent to take the biggest bite you can, otherwise you'll never see the end of the elephant. So,
Thank you. Councillor Brosnan, Deputy Mayor Brosnan, would you like your right of reply?
Thank you, and I'm really heartened by everyone who spoke in support. Thank you very much, because I think all of your points are really well made, and this is not about individuals around this table, but it's about a policy that will stand. I just want to speak on a couple of points that came up during debate. There are people in working in employment situations that are naturally eligible for central government support, and as Councillor Brown pointed out, even from their employers, that we are not. And I just want to reiterate how different we are from a staff situation. I think Hayley's point was very well made, that 2,000 was calculated on just our scheduled meetings, and every returning councillor, and indeed all new councillors, will know that your scheduled 2-hour meetings are nothing like your commitment. I think if councillors were working 100 hours per year for their salary, there would be community uproar. So this is 2,000 goes nowhere towards the amount of work that is actually undertaken in terms of hours, and how this is merely a contribution. And the point was also really well made that you can only claim up to that amount if you've spent that amount while on council business, and that if the calculations are correct, we'll never hit that 6,000 even if it's sitting in the policy. There was a conversation someone raised around this isn't normal. I'd just like to say, through the Remuneration Authority, this is the new norm in local governance nationally. This is their well-researched, well-submitted recommendations around what a maximum should look like in local governance. In fact, if we adopt a policy of less than what they have said, we are one of only 2 in the country to do that. And I actually think we're more progressive than that. I think higher than us. The Remuneration Authority considered it. They considered the community perception. They are our independent body. They are our, without prejudice, without political influence, body that makes those recommendations to us, and they have considered it well. What I propose on the board is their wording, and thank you very much for the very good debate.
Could I ask a procedural question, please? If this resolution is defeated, is it possible to
We return to the
return to the
original.
original? Thank you.
That being the case, I now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. We might need a raise of hands, I suspect. And against? So the motion is defeated, which brings the original motion back onto the table, which I am. Does anyone have any questions or discussion before I move that? And actually, yes, I would like to propose that there is an amendment to the original motion in terms of No, you're doing a fantastic job. I'm watching with great respect. I would like to remove the specifications around when the allowance can be claimed, and having the more generic point that it is available for any council business. So that really is the only change I'd like to propose to the original motion.
Just a point of clarification. So the wording where it says they are engaged on local authority business,
yep.
That's what you're proposing?
Yes.
Is there a definition around that?
If I may. I don't think you'll need it for £2,000.
As the Remuneration Authority states that what they mean by local authority business is what the council would generally understand to be their business.
Thank the Remuneration Authority for their clarity.
Clarity.
So, just sorry, but if you meet a group of residents and have a chat with them, have a cup of coffee, you claim that's part of your responsibility as a councillor. So you can claim that time if you have to put your child into care while you go and do that.
If council wanted to put some more specific parameters around that, it would be.
Okay, so I propose that rather than having that one generic statement, we retain the one bullet points as here, but in the third to bottom one, where attendance at civic events, etc., we extend that to cover, say, if you have
ward meetings or a community event. Yeah. I was thinking the next one.
Yeah,
Citizenship ceremonies, Napier Civic Awards, extend that to also cover community events, engagement, yeah.
Council
Wording.
organised.
Council organised events.
Doesn't that, would that preclude any resident organised events? So, per my residents associations ask for a meeting, that would exclude that by that definition? I'm asking for clarity.
So you've been invited as a guest in your council capacity.
Could you
Neighbourhood
just
support.
could you just say where an event is unclear, a determination by the mayor would be made?
Madam Chair, if I can point out, the last bullet point right at the bottom of the page actually covers that off, where all claims have to be approved by you anyway. So therefore, that's where justification can be made if there's something outside the norm.
I don't have any kids like that. So
yeah.
So perhaps if we do just amend that bullet point to extend it to, what was the terminology that you used, Deputy Mayor Brosnan?
Council organised.
Council organised, although that doesn't cover off authorised.
Which then allows
Council
your
authorised events.
Yeah. Who does the authorising?
Perfect.
It's inherent.
Okay. So I'm happy to move the motion in its current form. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mawson. I'm not intending to speak to the motion. Did anyone else wish to speak? No? So I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against?
Sorry, hands.
Who was against?
Just
hands. Oh, and Tapani. Oh, and Tapani. Sorry.
All right, as usual, making my mind up as we're having the conversation.
Just confirming 3 of what not just waving.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for that robust debate. Very good. Do we want, does some people need a quick break?
Thank you.
Just adjourn the meeting quickly.
Oh, and the racing.
So, we're going to